Ahora nos acompaña Ilona Boniwel para dictar la conferencia Organizaciones positivas, manos a la obra. Al igual que en las conferencias anteriores, al finalizar tendremos la sesión de preguntas de la audiencia. Favor de poner sus celulares en modo silencio. Hemos tenido mucha participación en redes sociales de todas las personas que siguen esta transmisión de manera remota. Nos interesa conocer su opinión, así que los invitamos a seguir participando a través de nuestras redes sociales, utilizando los hashtags Tiempos de Cambio y Soy TecMilenio.
Ilona Boniwel es autora de libros como La ciencia de la felicidad en pocas palabras y coautora de La educación en felicidad, lecciones sobre bienestar para escuelas secundarias. Es coeditora del Oxford Handbook of Happiness, es miembro del consejo de AIPA, la Asociación Internacional de Psicología Positiva, y de IPEN, la Red Internacional de Educación Positiva. Su trabajo se ha realizado primordialmente en Francia, Reino Unido y Portugal, así como en Sudáfrica y Japón. Recibámosla con un fuerte aplauso.
Hello everybody. Can you hear me better than yesterday? Let's try. Some of you would have been there yesterday, so you know they have voice troubles. It's coming back slowly, but it's not completely back yet. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here yet again and to talk to you about the other part of the work that we are doing on positive organizations. Saying that, it's actually a very difficult act to follow Michael and Marissa, because they have given such fantastic presentations with a lot of research and lots of different details. So let's hope there'll be some value added, but it would be a hard act. So this time round, we'll concentrate not on education as yesterday, but on business, on building positive organizations. And I'll be talking to you from a perspective of both researcher, but more so from a perspective of a practitioner of doing this in organizations and bringing these practices into organization. So, to start with, a little question. It requires a bit of math. Are you good at mathematics? Yeah? I hope you feel good about that, yeah? Okay, so how many hours do we spend at work during our lifetime? Come on, anybody wants to shout out? How many hours do we spend at work during our lifetimes? A lot, yes. Any sort of precise number? 15,000. Okay, 15,000 going once, twice. Anybody going up? Sorry? 76,000, great. Yes, that's quite a significant gap. Great. Anybody going up again? 130. Well done. Okay. There is no precise number, but approximately it falls somewhere between 80 and 120,000, depending what you take as a basis. So if you take France, for example, where I currently live, you would take 253 working days, multiplied by 8 working hours, multiplied by 40 years, which is what you need to actually get a pension. And then you're going to end up with approximately 81,000. Saying that, if you're an executive, if you are engaged very heavily in what you are doing, if you're a manager, etc., chances are you are going to end up with something like 120, 130. Because when I calculate in the French way, I take into account something like 7 weeks holidays. Please raise your hand if you have 7 weeks holidays. Well, okay. And if we take the holidays down, the number is going to go up anyway. So, and the question is, I mean, between 80, 120, 130, this is a huge number of hours, isn't it? And how do you feel during all those hours? Because it's a huge chunk of our life, enormous, gigantic chunk of our life. So do you feel happy and fully engaged during this enormous chunk of your life? Because, in all honesty, it's a good idea too. I mean, otherwise, what a waste of life it would be. So, if we look at the world of work, I mean, we know it's changing crazily, rapidly. Demographic changes, We are not going to be in the same job. Most of us are not going to be in the same job. Globalization, outsourcing. I mean, a huge amount of changes going on. In the last 20 years, huge number of changes have arrived. In the next 20 years, huge number of changes will arrive yet again. So how do we feel during all those changes? If you look at some of the Gallup data, there are some scary numbers sometimes coming up, like something like worldwide, only 13% of employees are engaged. I mean, okay, it's Gallup data, we're not going to discuss all of it, but only 13% of employees are engaged. I live in France, I mentioned. In France, if we look at it, it is actually quite scary. We are talking about 9% of engagement. US, by the way, is doing much better. In England as well. So, what are the factors to take into account? What are the factors in play? And when we work in organizational settings, before we introduce the positive, people share their worries. And people share their worries about the people wanting to leave, the turnover being quite high, the permanent struggle for keeping talents, and talents not moving to Dubai, to China, to Singapore. So for example, us in Europe, we actually struggle with keeping talents, for example. We struggle, I think many of us struggle, with psychosocial issues at work, with mental health issues at work, like anxiety, like depression. Depression, for example, in Europe, in many different countries, not all, but like France, Spain, for example, as well, is actually being quite high. And the cost, obviously, of the sickness absence, presenteeism, and reduced productivity. By the way, different countries obviously have different struggles. Once I was giving the presentation in Japan, and I was talking about absenteeism. And then afterwards, I finished my presentation, I came downstairs, and my translator told me, you know, there are certain things you probably shouldn't mention as a problem in Japan, because absenteeism is really not an issue. Our issue is we don't know what to do, how to send the sick people back home. Because they all turn up with a temperature of 40, and they're sitting there, and there is special police going around companies checking if the sick people manage to turn up to work, and if the employer managed not to spot them and not to send them back home. So different countries have different issues. Us, we have the problem of absenteeism. In France, for example, that's a huge problem. In Japan, that is not a problem. I don't know whereabouts you are sitting on that, but I guess probably closer to France, right? So, and if you look at some other facts, for example, research shows that working more than 11 hours a day is consistently associated with much more depression in comparison to people working less hours. If you look at travelers, people who frequently travel at work, their medical claims for work, medical claims are higher, psychological illness claims are higher, and even the claims from the spouses of people who travel are higher. So if your spouse travels a lot and it's you stuck with the kids at home, chances are you're not feeling so well about it, like my husband does. So if we look at the data, for example, in the financial sector, looking at the stress and depression in the financial sector, of course, it's not a surprise to most of us that during the 2007-2008 crisis, 61% of brokers suffered depression. I mean, we can guess why. Saying that, if you're actually looking at the sector today, in fact, about 70% of people working in the sector wouldn't want to speak about their health concern or mental health concerns, or investment bank, for example, finding that this is one of the most stressful jobs in finance, 60% admitting to poor quality of sleep. I was recently standing in front of Goldman Sachs, and I could see quite a few nods going, yes, yes, and yes. Well, okay, let's turn to the positive, right? Because I was talking about all these problems. How do we approach it? And that's precisely like the previous two speakers were saying, we can look at it from this perspective of a problem. And how do we treat the problems that we are currently facing in the world of work? So this is called the so-called deficit approach, which we begin by identifying the problems. What are the problems? What are the causes of the problems? And how can we treat the causes of the problems? And the fundamental assumption that the best manager is somebody who's really, really good in problem solving. Or we can look at it from a different perspective, from a positive perspective, or so-called abundance approach, which is looking at what are the best things that are happening here in this workplace, what are the best experiences that this group of people were living together, and why Why? What enabled those best things to happen? What are the resources underlying those best experiences at work? So the whole approach of positive psychology and appreciative inquiry, changing the question upside down and focusing on what's working rather than what's not working. For example, where this process or change management process was implemented successfully. Why was it successful here? What can we learn from the success story? What about this employee that makes him or her so successful in this role? Why are they an example? What are those strengths that they're bringing to this particular job? And what can we learn about those strengths? Why is it that this team is consistently exceeding expectations? And how can we identify those practices and promote them to other teams so other teams can exceed expectations as well? So in a sense, we are moving from this surviving or deficit approach to the thriving approach. The deficit culture, the culture of conflict, the stress, the blame, the no end, the draining basically, to the culture beyond being okay, but the culture of friendships and resilience and optimism and yes and. I'm sure many of you would know what it feels like when you're in the workplace with this type of culture. When I was very young, when I only started my university career at the time, I remember coming to my second job, sort of one of the first jobs really, but second job in the university. And from the very first day, something was quite weird. Because people met me and they said, you know, just to warn you, we don't do things kind of in the same way like everywhere else here. You will see there are some strange things happening here, but I hope you will like it. So I look like, what sort of strange things are happening? And they'll tell me, you know, there are certain things we can't say here, all right? We can't say the university. Weird. The university. We cannot. All right, why not? We can only say our university. Weird. Why not? Why is it our? Because actually, that's coming from the top leadership, you know. But our Vice Chancellor really believes that there is no such a thing as the university. Because the university is that organization out there. It's nothing to do with me. So if I say the university, it means it's not my university. But we can say my university or our university because we are all this university. There is no such a thing as this university out there. Our university is us. Each one of us. That was the first thing somebody told me. And indeed, nobody said the university here. And everybody always said our or my university. And indeed, there was something amazing there because the sense of ownership that we all felt being there in our university and carrying our university forward was remarkable. There were some other strange things happening, like I've been warned about it, and it was true that our Vice Chancellor, and by the way, we had 25,000 students, so I think we were about 2,000 or 3,000 staff members at the time. Our Vice Chancellor would come to every induction, every staff induction, and before coming to every staff induction, he would memorize every name of every person. And that was kind of quite amazing. Okay, the guy was a genius, right? I mean, I can't do that. I would love to do that with all the people I do. I teach, for example, I can't do it. The guy had a fantastic memory, but it was so amazing that every time afterwards he met you, anybody, the cleaner, any of the staff members, anywhere, he would say, hello, Joan, how are you doing? What's happening with this project? There was this amazing feeling of friendship, amazing feeling of togetherness. We were all together in it, and we knew who we were. We were not just separate bolts in this big picture of the university. We were making it together. So this is how it feels like. I'm sure if I asked you to share your stories, for all of those who are working here, you would tell me many wonderful stories. And for those who don't work here, I mean, I hope one day you have a fantastic chance to work here, by the way. But for those who don't work here, think of the best work experience you ever had. And what were the factors defining this best work experience? What was so special about it? So all this learning, as we know, come from many different strands of research nowadays, from positive psychology, of course, and I'm not going to introduce it again, from positive organizational scholarship associated with the University of Michigan, working on questions such as positive deviance, engagement, meaning at work, from positive organizational behavior stream associated with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, from positive organizational psychology that we had so much chance to hear about, from the studies of positive leadership, or we can say the ability to mobilize, facilitate, and develop a community of exceptional performance using things like individual strengths, optimism, motivation, and energy as drivers. So from studies of positive leadership, from the studies of appreciative inquiry. In fact, there are so many different groups of researchers and strands of researchers working on these questions right now to understand what really contributes to the individual flourishing at work. So let's talk about some of those main factors. We talk about the happy and productive worker hypothesis, happiness at work, engagement at work. In fact, yes, there's lots and lots of research confirming that even though obviously happiness is a very fashionable subject nowadays, and it's kind of almost everywhere, and sometimes we wonder why it's important, we do know why it's important. We do know that, for example, happiness and well-being contribute to us living longer, contribute to us feeling healthier. We do know that happiness fuels creativity, that we are more creative, we are capable of thinking of more solutions, of looking at the larger picture, of finding solutions that are unorthodox and don't fit the mainstream. It does drive innovation, it changes the brain activity, we actually think better when we're in a happy state. So there are many, many contributions from happiness to the workplace, indirect and direct. Meta-analysis do show that happiness contributes to reduced turnover, that happiness contributes to reduced absenteeism, that it prevents lots of different costs associated with health problems, for example, that contributes to sociability, etc. And it does show also that happiness in some way contributes to productivity, even though there are certain studies that show that productivity or performance also contributes to us feeling happy. So there is kind of an important loop here in the story. So saying that happiness is not the only main factor at work, there is another factor which is as essential, if not more essential, and here we talk about engagement. So when we're really talking happiness in the workplace, it's really well-being and engagement. These are the two very important contributors. Engagement, what do we mean by that? Well, it's basically a state in which people employ and express themselves fully, cognitively, physically, emotionally during their work performance. In fact, if you want to go further, there are many, 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 many definitions of what engagement is. I just picked up some of the main ones. Sometimes they mix well-being together with engagement. Sometimes they would focus fully on the personal experience of how they feel during their work task performance. Like, for example, Shafali, for whom engagement is characterized by vigor or energy, dedication to what you are doing, and full absorption in a task. What we do know, though, that engagement is a very, very important contributor to work performance from all different perspectives. We know that engaged companies provide better return on investment. We know that people who are engaged would actually contribute to increase in operating income. They would have lower levels of sickness, absence. They would have much more advocacy for their place to work. Some of the most engaged companies fully rely on their employees for bringing other employees in, because their employees are such good advocates of why it's so good to work here, that they bring their family, friends, people from everywhere, the best people from the industry to come and join the companies because they feel so good there. So the engagement contributes to customer loyalty and satisfaction, and engagement contributes to overall profitability and performance. So there is lots and lots and lots of data demonstrating that engagement is a very important element. So how many of you are, if I can have some light on, how many of you are company owners or managers in different companies? Please raise your hand. Okay, quite a few. Did you know that engagement was important? Yes? Because sometimes when I ask this question to people who are not that interested in psychology, but kind of have the gut feeling, Engagement may be the term that would be mentioned, but sometimes the managers would just say, yes, I know, if I want my workers to be performing well, to be contributing well, what I need is motivation. So engagement, in a sense, is a little bit beyond motivation. There are more characteristics of this notion. Nevertheless, it's actually in a close family to motivation. So why do I discriminate between well-being and engagement? In fact, I think the answer is clear. The best is when we have both engagement and well-being present, definitely. This is when we're actually going to end up in this quadrant at the top right, because we know that workers who are most happy and productive are those who are well and fully engaged in what they're doing. Engagement on its own, of course, this, by the way, a brilliant literature review undertaken by one of the think tanks in England. Engagement on its own, when it's not accompanied by well-being, can result potentially in burnout. Because if you're so engaged, and sacrificing everything outside of your working life, burnout may follow. So engagement in the long term, not accompanied by well-being, may potentially be dangerous. Well-being on its own, that's kind of a funny picture. Sometimes you look at it, this is on the bottom right. Well-being on its own, I mean, what's wrong with well-being at work? There is nothing wrong as such. But if well-being is not accompanied by engagement, we may end up with workers who are, well, they're good, they're fine. That's actually, by the way, one of the explanations of what's happening in France. There is a big category of workers who are actually quite happy at work, who are well, who will never lose their employment, who turn up there, have a cup of coffee, and another cup of coffee, and another cup of coffee, and a good chat with the colleagues, and plan their vacation of 7 to 9 weeks, and they're actually quite good. But they're not fully engaged in what they're doing. And so this well-being, if it's not accompanied by engagement, well, I think you can guess, it will contribute to productivity a little bit less. So what we are looking for is workers, is employees who are fully well and are fully engaged in what they're doing. And this actually produces the permanent positive spiral. Engagement contributes to well-being, and well-being contributes to engagement. So, now I'm going to be a bit more complicated, but it's actually not complicated. So, engagement and well-being are the important factors in fully functioning companies, in companies that are performing, and people who are feeling well. But what are the drivers? What are the main drivers? And that's what Marisa was talking about actually quite a lot of her presentation. What are the main drivers known by research, from research, that contribute to engagement and well-being? And these are some of them. By the way, there are many. I've taken actually some of the main models, like models of Ryan Deci, self-determination model, and the factors within this model, models of Peter Warr, the vitamin model of employment. Peter Warr is a very famous organizational psychologist in England who spent all of his working life identifying the drivers of well-being at work. Robertson and Cooper, organizational psychologist again in England, who developed an asset model of workplace well-being and well-being and resilience, and Martin and Dupuy, the Canadian researchers, who actually also worked on the subject very extensively. And so what we know, if we compare all the different drivers, we have some of the main drivers emerging, both at the personal level, organizational level, and job experience level, that would contribute to work engagement, well-being, and finally productivity. So to make it, again, this is going to appear complex, but in fact it's not complex at all, because it's an extremely simplified model. Because when empirical studies are undertaken, almost everything has a relationship with everything. So it's actually a very primitive model here for the sake of comprehension. So we can distinguish between this flourishing loop or performance indicators of the engagement, well-being, and their contribution to performance. And we also do know that performance contributes to worker well-being, so there is almost a stronger link, if not stronger, from the performance to well-being as from well-being to performance. And the indicators that and the drivers of performance, drivers or antecedents of performance, which we can actually potentially classify as individual resources, organizational resources, and job experience resources. Many of you If you remember all the slides from previous presentation, you will find many of these notions appearing in that as well. So let's go through and talk about some of those drivers and what we can do and how can we put those drivers into place and work on developing those resources in our organizations, individual resources, organizational resources, and job experience resources to contribute to both engagement, well-being, and subsequently performance. So just before I go further, there is an interesting hypothesis to consider. This hypothesis has been examined in many, many, many studies, and it seems there is quite good evidence, at least partial evidence, for the effectiveness of this hypothesis. This hypothesis comes from the vitamin model of Peter Warr. Peter Warr, as I mentioned, an organizational psychologist in Britain. What he postulated is that some of those drivers, some of those resources would act as different types of vitamins when it comes to employee well-being. So some of them, so the constant effect, would act as vitamin C and E. What it means is that some of those resources, they would increase well-being up to a certain level, and then after this level, actually well-being would not be increased anymore. And here we're talking about pain benefits, trust climate, managerial support, environmental condition, or social importance. So some sort of pain benefit can increase well-being to a certain level, but after a certain level, well, you're not going to actually end up with happier people afterwards. The other drivers actually act as vitamins, as additional decrement, A and D. What it means that at certain points, at high levels, those factors, those drivers may actually start contributing to decreased well-being, actually start becoming toxic. And here we're talking about autonomy, mastery, variety, structure, and relationships. And you can actually see why. Because somebody who's very, very, very autonomous may potentially disconnect from the organization. Because maybe so autonomous that actually might lose the social touch. Somebody who has a huge variety in their job, that's a huge positive driver to begin with, but then imagine you have 2,000 balls in the air. Well, you may imagine why at certain levels of variety actually starts contributing to decreased well-being. Structure, or job structure basically, clarity of role, knowing what you are doing, it's very important. But too much structure, well, you are stuck. Step to the right, step to the left. There is nothing else I can do. I'm so structured that actually my autonomy is undermined. And even relationships. It's extremely important to have great relationships at work with colleagues, with others, support and gratitude. But then at certain points, if you have so many relationships, imagine you have to talk to 200 people every day. What happens? Your well-being may actually start suffering. So it's a very interesting hypothesis, examined quite well by research, but I think much more research is needed. Nevertheless, worth considering. So what I propose in the last 15 minutes is to go through very quickly through some of those resources at the personal level, and also talk about some of the corresponding organizational interventions or practices that could be put in place. So if we're talking about individual resources, the first one is energy capital. It's basically feeling good in your body, feeling the energy, feeling strong. And many organizations put solutions into place, like the gym, for example, for their workers, like paying for the classes, for the fitness classes, etc., to contribute to maintaining this energy. Or, for example, as many do, would have a place to have a little nap. Do you like sleeping at work sometimes? Please raise your hand if you have ever slept at work. No, that's not an embarrassing question. That's an important question. That's an important question because we know that a little siesta. Yes, okay. And so having a space sometimes to have this short nap actually contributes to well-being, engagement, productivity. Well, resilience, that's an enormous topic. But individual resilience really contributes to engagement and well-being, and there are many, many different ways to develop it. There are many programs, like the Penn Resilience Program implemented in the American Army, for example, many other organizational programs to develop this personal resilience or bounce back. the stressor, perception of stressor, training the cognitive flexibility associated with resilience, training the optimism. Emotional agility, or our capacity to interact, to take fully into account the messages from our emotions. It's also an important indicator. And here we're talking about positive emotions, of course, but not only positive emotions, because research shows that managers who are open also to the negative emotions of their colleagues and are able to hear them are better managers. So it's not just about, and of course it's very much about cultivating positive emotions, but it's about cultivating overall emotional competence to fully interact and use and make the full use of all positive and negative emotions. And for example, as a case study, many of you would have heard about very famous program, Search Inside Yourself at Google, that works on the development of mindfulness and attention and emotional regulation in many of Google employees, and many, many, many other examples of bringing mindfulness to work. Time competence, that's another subject I'm absolutely passionate about. How do we manage our time, and to what extent our use of time, our relationship with our time can contribute to well-being? Actually, to a huge extent, as research shows. That's one of my research topics that is absolutely fascinating. And in fact, there are obviously many personal solutions that we can put in place to assume greater responsibility for time. But it's not only about personal solutions, there are organizational solutions too. And there are some interesting, very unusual solutions that have been sometimes put in place, like giving people unlimited giving people money, to take their family on vacation to ensure they fully disconnect. That sounds good, right? Because you have conditions to fulfill. A, you have to go on vacation, or you don't get the money. B, you must fully disconnect. C, you can't work whilst on vacation. How does that sound? Yes? And why? Because actually, once you fully disconnect, you are better afterwards. So if you manage to fully disconnect and recover, you work better. So it actually makes perfect business sense as well. Or another one, please raise your hand if you are fed up with emails. Only 2 people? 3, 4, 5 dead? Come on, let's try again. Please raise your hand if you are fed up with emails. Okay, more than half. I think we are getting there. They're a very important means of communication, of course. But don't you think that sometimes we have too much? Just a little bit too much? Something like, okay, who has more than 50 emails a day? More than 100? More than 200? Okay, no. Okay, so, thank you very much. Some of the great solutions have been put into place to also help people with their time competence skills is minimizing the number of emails we receive. And that's very often done internally, to at least if we cannot control the flow of email from external sources, what can we do to control the flow of email from internal sources? And actually, like, different social networking solutions are very often more effective than sending permanent emails to each other. And actually, one of the case studies, quite a famous one, Atos, an information company, actually eliminated or tried to eliminate all internal mail, reporting huge increase in productivity. So, and of course, another personal driver or personal resource is confidence, or when we speak more in psychological terms, self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is this feeling that I can. Maybe it's not a guarantee that I will succeed, but at least I can try. I can have a go, and having this confidence to have a go. And Michael told us a great story about a cleaner. I have also a cleaner story. It comes from the Chateau Foam company, a company in France that organizes seminars and conferences for businesses in beautiful hotels. So it's very famous for beautiful hotels and beautiful castles. So you have a seminar, you come to a beautiful castle and you have it there. And it's actually one of the greatest places to work in France. And their story was that one day a client arrived to the airport at something like 5 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, and the taxi didn't arrive. So he was supposed to be picked up and the taxi didn't arrive, and for some very strange reason, his card didn't work. So he couldn't even withdraw the money to pay the taxi. And he was desperately calling calling basically the office, so somebody please tell me what's going on, but in the unusual time, so nobody was picking up the phone. There was somebody who picked up the phone at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was a cleaner cleaning the office, cleaning the space. She picked up the phone, and the first thing she did, she said, okay, don't worry, we'll find a solution. She went out, she got into her car, she drove to the airport, she picked up the client, she brought him back. Okay, and I think for me that's a great illustration of self-efficacy, and of course, much more organizational alignment, organizational belonging, etc. So let's talk now a little bit about the organizational resources. Some of the organizational resources like pay benefit, trust climate, etc. So some of them are obvious. Pay and benefits are a bit funny because we do know that up to a certain amount of pay, actually pay does not necessarily increase well-being and engagement. In fact, many studies show that really motivating by the increase of pay can result in precisely the opposite consequences, actually decreasing well-being, engagement, and productivity. And nevertheless, pay is an important factor in the story, especially with regard to transparency, with regard to whether the pay is rightly earned or not. And pay can be a huge demotivator, in fact, rather than a huge motivator. So it's something to be taken into account. The second one is climate of trust, equality, being able to trust others, being able to have this feeling that you can say whatever you want to say sometimes, and you're not going to be fired, or you can make a mistake, and this mistake is okay, because mistake is something that contributes to our development rather than something going to be ending up in punishment, immediate punishment. So this climate of trust is a very important variable, but a tricky variable to build. It's based on equity, it's based on equality, and it is tricky. As somebody very famous once said, climate is strategy for breakfast. This climate of trust, it's easy to talk about, it's very difficult to affect. Because sometimes you can put strategies in place, but the climate is difficult to penetrate. To give an example, a bit of a negative example, I recently went to one company in France, I'm not going to be naming it, and they did something amazing. They really decided to focus on well-being in their workplace, and they started by space, which is a great initiative. They redesigned the space, they made something like the village where people can come together and talk together and eat together. They provided all the teas and coffees and fruits and snacks and sandwiches and all different types of foods. They provided fantastic desks, really comfortable ergonomic desks. They actually created a fantastic well-being environment. I was talking to an HR, and she was saying, I don't know what we did wrong, but something's going on here. Because, look, we've created this great space for people to come together. They do everything to avoid eating together. Because actually there is room going on that they think there are cameras installed everywhere, and that we are spying on them during their meals together. So we've created all this space, but they don't trust us. They don't believe it is for their well-being. They think it was done for some other purpose, like to spy on them. Well, it's a negative example of a well-being intervention, and also shows that even though physical environment may be a factor in play, it's not the only solution to be put in place if you are really trying to affect the well-being and engagement drivers. But it's an interesting example to what extent this climate of trust can be very powerful in a positive and negative way. Of course, managerial support. Everybody, I think there is nobody who does not agree that leadership, managerial support are essential factors in play. And there are many different models of positive leadership nowadays. My favorite one actually is coming from Robert Quinn. I don't know if you have heard about it. I would urge you to look at it. It's a model of positive leadership in which, it's quite tricky to read. He actually hypothesizes that positive leadership is not just about using the positive language and drivers, kind of all the things in the top inner circle to inspire people. A positive leadership is a capacity to be bilingual, to be able to talk the management as usual language and the positive language at the same time. And the capacity to find the balance between growth focus, for example, and cost control. Inspiring intrinsic motivation and being very clear on the role. Deliberation with a group, but also being able to make decisive actions that sometimes an individual can take. So basically what he's saying, that positive leadership is the capacity to balance the two opposites successfully. And this model of positive leadership really makes sense, enormous sense to me, because it brings together, rather than creating this divide between management as usual and the positive management, positive leadership, it actually brings the two together. What he's saying further, that all of them, all of those factors, positive factors in the inner circle, can have negative consequences if taken too far. So group deliberation might end up, we deliberate, we can't make a decision. It might end up in indecisiveness. On the other hand, decisive action, I decide, I'm able to decide, might end up in exclusion, because it's only me who decides and I don't bring people together. Cost control would end up in austerity, or growth focused, well, in waste. So the outer circle are the negative consequences of positive behaviors, whilst actually managing the positive managerial behaviors within the inner circle can be the key to positive leadership. So there are some other, that's a bit of a busy slide actually, some other excellent techniques like personal management interview, for example. That is one of the evidence-based strategies that contributes, and they know really contributes to both well-being and engagement and high productivity. What it means is actually having conversation, structured conversation with your direct reports on quite a permanent basis, every couple of weeks, every week if you like, having 1 hour face-to-face with an agenda more or less directed by the employee themselves, in which all different questions are discussed. And this technique sounds extremely time-consuming. Nevertheless, actually, by implementing this technique, one of the outcomes is that managers find more time, because actually productivity and fluidity is so much better. So, I told you the bad story about environmental conditions. In fact, it's also a very important positive resource. Of course, having safe environment, physically safe environment, having not too much exposure to noise, for example, having comfortable working environment or colorful working environment. There are great studies nowadays coming on the use of color in the working environment, also contributes to positive outcomes. So I have a question to you, another question. It's going to be a quiz. Which one do you prefer for work, for yourself? Do you prefer a closed office where you can close your door and there you are, you can actually think? The cubicle, when you kind of have a bit of privacy and a bit of openness at the same time, or the open space environment? Can I have some light, please? Because I need the show of hands. Light, magically? No, magic doesn't work. If I try this? No, still doesn't work. Okay, let's try without light. So, who prefers, oh no, now we have even less. I'm obviously doing something wrong here. So who prefers the closed office? So you can close your door and you can concentrate. Okay. Who prefers, I couldn't see at the end, okay. Who prefers the cubicle? All right.
Ask them again about the lights.
So, please, lights. Yes, great. Okay, let's start again. So, the closed office. Okay. The cubicle. Okay. The open space. All right. Okay, we have some people saying 1, 2, 3. That was fun. So which one is actually better based on research? Because we have research now to understand the influences of each. And indeed, closed office is much better for concentration, because you're isolating the sound, you can focus, you are not affected by everybody else coming in, etc. The open space is much better for collaboration. It's much better for collaboration. We don't send an email, because sometimes in the closed office we might end up sending an email to somebody next door. We actually ask them humanly a question. So we talk to them. we interact, we connect, we relate, etc. So closed office, so open office is actually open space, much better for collaboration, creativity, building teams. The cubicle, well, it actually is the worst of all, because it has the inconveniences of both. It has the noise of the open space, because noise travels very easily, and actually it doesn't have that very good closed space for concentration of the closed office. So actually this, research-wise, it's the worst of all. And actually what many companies are doing is that precisely integrating the first and the third one, is having the open space for collaboration and having some of the space to escape into, if necessary, when necessary, to actually concentrate. And there are some interesting things sometimes that come around when you talk about physical space, sometimes quite unexpected. So I was doing once training to one of the companies, big construction, and we were talking about many different drivers, how we can affect resources, how we can draw resources, what can we put in place to maximize well-being engagement. And there was one moment in which that actually everybody got so engaged in discussion, that was almost crazy. And the moment was that I had all the directors team in front of me, managers team, and they said, there is something, we actually made a decision, collective, it was a decision coming from the top, that in fact, we cannot have anything personable on our working space. No photos of, maybe maximum one photo of children, that's it. But no objects, nothing. All the desks have to be the same, not to be cluttered. And in fact, that was enormous suffering expressed through that. In a very funny way, that probably was the most important driver for them, that they lost the feeling that their working space was their own. In fact, some of the very, very simple working practices are about being able to personalize your working space. So actually, it's okay to make it how you like it. It's all right. It's perfectly all right. Make it your own. Make it your home. Sometimes very little practices like giving very small sum of money for a decorating budget to personalize your space can send very positive messages to employees. Again, you are trusted. You are autonomous. You can choose how and what you would like to put onto your desk to make it your own. And of course, there are some extreme examples, very, very interesting ones, like Lego offices. I don't know if you've ever been to any. They have amazing decorations inside. But I have another question for you. Where do you think people work better together? If you look at the top left or at the top right, around which of those tables people work better? Left. Who is for left? Okay, why? Again, very strange findings, but logical if you think about them, is that round shape of a table does make a difference. We are more collaborative, we are more open to a collaborative solution around the round shape of the table. Or another one, I love the picture on the bottom left, is that, again, that's one of the research findings, is that if we have high ceiling, this really contributes to creativity. So here, we are going to be all very, very creative, you know? Because I think we're talking about seriously high ceiling. And you see, and even if you don't have the high ceiling, well, you can paint the sky, put the grass down, and remove the chairs. And there you go, you have the high ceiling effect. That's a great solution. So, and of course, social importance and meaning, the meaning we bring to work. And thank you to Michael for a fantastic presentation on the subject. And there are again many practices, interesting practices, to bring this sense of collective meaning and collective identity to employees. It's another case study. Orange, it's a very big telecom company. It used to be France Telecom, and now it's called Orange in France. It's one of the two biggest ones. And I was having training with them another day, and there was a very interesting story that came out. We spoke about one of the techniques, or to put into place one of the solutions of a grand narrative, because we feel a sense of belonging to the company when we know the story of the company, the vision of the company, why this company started, how it grew, what it was its vision, what happened next, like a belonging to the story, that we are part of this bigger story. And I realized that there was a story in the company, But the story was a weird one, because orange has become very famous, or infamous in France, for a basically big wave of suicides that happened about 15 years ago. So many of the managers actually ended up taking their life, and there were many suicides coming together, mainly caused by increased stress of work. And the story of Orange became almost, look, we had so many suicides, and we did everything right, and we put many solutions into place, and now we don't have suicides anymore. That's a great story, right? And actually, there is a huge story to tell, because the same Orange, the same France Telecom, was responsible for bringing the first internet to France. It was called Minitel. So this company brought the very precursor of the internet for the whole of France. This little strange box called Minitel, connecting people. It is the company that opened the door to connecting people in France by bringing internet in. And they realized that about 1/3 of their own employees don't know that. And that's a big story to tell. So knowing this story, connecting to this story, the big story, also contributes to us finding personal meaning in what we are doing. And finally, about the job experience factors, autonomy, mastery, variety, structure, and relationships. I think I only have very little time left. So autonomy we spoke about already. Your own capacity to decide how you work, when you work. The results-only job environment, for example, is what hours you're working and you deciding on your own direction of your tasks. Mastery is your capacity to fully use your strengths at work. It's your learning opportunities, career development, basically enhancing mastery as you go along. And there are lots of amazing practices we can think about of the integrating the strengths approach to the whole mastery development organizations. So we're trying to sit down and think of the integrating the strengths into the HR employee life cycle, so to translate this knowledge to the HR professionals as well. In fact, it's not just one-off. Let's measure your strengths, and off we go. In fact, strengths can be used at any different levels. Strengths can be used at the attraction and selection level to make sure that we are really recruiting for the right strengths that are needed. Strengths can be used for the onboarding through strengths introduction. Basically, people who are coming in, introducing themselves through their strengths, and others introducing themselves through their strengths as well. Strengths can be used in development, especially around team complementarity, making sure that we have the right strengths around the table, that we have all the necessary strengths covered, and how can we make sure about it? In annual review, in job crafting, to start adjusting your position to what you have the best in yourself. Strengths can be used in retention. And here we can make use of things like positive 360. We know the 360 technique actually, there's lots of interesting new research coming that it's not necessarily such a positive technique sometimes, because when we have the normal 360, we very often concentrate on the negative feedback that we receive and not necessarily on the positive one. So positive 360, what do other people see as the strengths in you, and how can you integrate it? And of course, in even leaving and reorientation. Perhaps in this job you don't use your strengths fully. So how can you possibly make sure that your next step fits even better with who you are? So at every stage of employee life cycle, we can integrate the notion of strengths. But that requires quite a bit of work, quite a bit of thinking, quite a bit of development. So variety, of course, variety of different tasks. Structure, we talked about the structure of the job role. Again, very, very essential. And of course, building the relationships. Building relationships, because this is almost the basis of how we experience our job. So I'm going to stop here. There are a few slides I didn't manage to cover. So but I hope it has given you some ideas of how to take this great research finding and translate them into something concrete when we are intervening in organizations and trying to make a difference. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Damos inicio a la última sesión de preguntas con la misma dinámica de nuestras sesiones anteriores. Tendremos 2 participaciones.
Please say something again, because I didn't understand it. So, yes, please. Okay, thank you.
Well, hello. I got just too late yesterday, so I had to ask you now.
Okay, yes, that's right. You tried and you didn't manage to, I know.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I just began reading your book, Science of Happiness, and since the beginning it kind of shocked me because it was like, I'm in tech millennium, and they want us to search for our happiness, to set these goals and in some sort of direction that we can achieve that. But with your presentation and the ones before you, I really come to realize that maybe it's not the final step, but the first. So we can achieve this progress and balance as a society. And given this, I see it, and it's a big challenge. I see it as that, but well, I'm up for it. And I wanted to ask you if you could like give us the core of it, like the most important in your great experience that you can give as an advice for us, for all of us, that we are the changing generation, the new ones with this task of making things work better.
Thank you for this question. So, thank you. So in terms of happiness as being the final goal, I'm not sure about happiness being the final goal. I agree with you, because I think it's a very important, happiness skills are very important. Happiness, there are some studies actually demonstrating that when we set happiness, expectations for happiness as the most important goal, sometimes we can actually have decreased happiness, so there are some backfired results. So, nevertheless, I think it's less about the happiness as a goal, but more about the drivers of well-being, engagement, that we can probably concentrate on. And it's difficult to give the best experience, but I've witnessed so many beautiful, beautiful experiences in organizations with children. But I think most of the best experiences really come from relatedness, from people getting together, opening up, and helping each other. So actually, in a funny way, there was one practice I didn't manage to talk about. It was the so-called reciprocity ring. And probably some of my best experiences have happened when I use this practice. It's actually about enabling everybody in the group to express an issue, a concern, openly at a personal or professional level, and getting others to help them, or help them with a solution, help them with an idea, help them with something very concrete if they could help. And it is sometimes amazing how with such practice, so much emotion, positive emotion can be generated, so much closeness, such a huge feeling of belonging, and belonging to this big family. This can happen in a school setting, this can happen in an organizational setting. For me, probably the biggest, really biggest contributor are relationships and nourishing those relationships. So thank you very much. Have another question.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's like I follow this kind of Buddhism tradition, the meditation, Vipassana is the name, and there is this phrase, this motto that kind of confirms everything I've seen these 2 days, and it has been so great, so thank you to all. The name is a mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, is with this kind of thing, mala. It's not a simple purse or, bracelet, is a mala, and with this, the meaning is to wish success, well-being, happiness, and peace for all living beings. So I guess the answer, thank you, is we are the answer. We are trying again and again until we can find this place of balance or the up close we can get. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Okay. Yes, please.
Hola. Antes que nada, gracias por la conferencia. Cuando yo veo a mi papá, yo digo que no me gustaría ser mucho como él, porque a mí no me gustaría trabajar en un cubículo, todo eso, yo se lo he dicho. A mí me gustaría trabajar en un ambiente donde haya más gente. Y cuando yo trabajo en un equipo o algo así, veo como mi papá también lo hace y yo también lo hago. No sé si es porque son mis amigos, yo no suelo ser muy duro, a mí me gusta hacer que las cosas se hagan bien, pero cuando yo hago equipo con los que no son mis amigos, yo sí suelo ser más duro, que me gusta que las cosas se hagan bien. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo puedo ser igual de perfeccionista y exigente con mis amigos sin que se vea muy duro?
Well, that's a great question. That's a great question because that's a very nice question because obviously sometimes this association of positive leadership with being nice and very positive and kind of very fluffy is actually misleading. And this is why I would invite you to go back to this model of Robert Quinn, because positive leadership is not just about being nice and about agreeing with everybody and about enjoying working together. And of course, it's partly about that, because we want to bring collective intelligence in, we want to hear everybody's opinion, we want everybody to contribute, we want really to exchange. But it's also about the deliverables. It's also about being tough. It's also about setting sometimes very precise goals, very ambitious goals, and very ambitious deadlines, and actually making sure that things are delivered to a perfect standard. So which is why this idea of positive management as the capacity to be bilingual, to talk, to live the positive example, while at the same time communicating and leaving the management as usual practices, probably for me offers very, very, very good keys to understanding what it can be like to function as a positive leader. It's not one or another. It is, I mean, we have spent the last 100 years working on management models, or more than 100 years, and we have actually got some great conclusions from previous management practices. So it's about bringing them together and reuniting them through a bridge. It's about that and that. So thank you for your question. Don't worry about being tough. Just don't forget to be nice at the same time. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Time's is up, I think. So hope to see many of you at the workshop to practice some of those practices. Thank you.
Damos por terminada la sesión de preguntas y agradecemos a Ilona Boniwel por su interesante conferencia.